Today is Friday, November 20th, 2015, and we're interviewing Robert Cowles at the Illinois State Library. Robert is 68 years old, having been born on November 5th, 1947. My name is Sue Burkholder, and I'll be the interviewer. Robert, would you please state for the recording in what war and branch of service that you served?
I served in Vietnam with the U.S. Army.
All right. Let's start with just a little bit about your beginnings, where you were born and your family, if you had any siblings, that type of thing.
I was born in Springfield, Illinois, and my mom and dad ran a grocery store for a small company out of Petersburg, Illinois called West Food Stores. I have two older brothers, one born in 1936. I also have sisters born in 1940 who died in 1944. My middle brother was born in 1944, right before she passed away, and she died of a brain tumor. I was the youngest, and I think I had a good childhood. We ate well, having owned a grocery store, and things were pretty decent. I was an underachiever in school. I didn't do very well in high school. In fact, I got flunked chemistry as a freshman, or as a sophomore. Freshman year, I flunked French, and I flunked the second semester junior English, and I got kicked out of wood shop, and I had to pass gym to graduate. And the only reason I got the credit for that is I had a good friend that marked me as being present for gym, even though I was skipping it. I worked part-time in a grocery store my sophomore, or in between my junior and senior year, and also worked there full-time for about 6 months after I got out of high school, at which time I joined the Army. I enlisted for 4 years. That was a European assignment, and I did go to Germany before I went to Vietnam.
So why did you choose that specific branch of the military?
I don't know. Ended up being the dumbest, smartest thing I ever did in my life. I went through basic training at Fort Leonard Wood and qualified to go to Officers Candidate School. That threw me into an infantry MOS, so I went through infantry AIT at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And by the time I got out of AIT, I realized that to be commissioned, you have to be 19 years old, and I would have been a holdover at Fort Dix for a while in order to been 19 and commissioned as a second lieutenant. And I also realized that it didn't make much sense for a 19-year-old kid to be telling people that are 25 to 35 years old that had been in the service for a number of years what to do. Orders did come through for Europe, and I talked to my platoon sergeant about, I'm supposed to go to OCS, and he said, well, we'll cancel that. And I got to thinking, I said, no, we won't. Let's go to Europe. So I went to Germany, and I was stationed with the 24th Infantry Division at Reconnecting in Augsburg, Germany. Shortly after I got there, I was promoted to PFC E3. Pay grades are E1 through E9, and I guess I took to the Army. I was in a mechanized infantry outfit. We did a lot of war game playing. We were an Allied Mobile Force Battalion. Each of the NATO countries had an Allied Mobile Force Battalion. We would be the first to go in if something happened. In fact, in '66, during the Six-Day War with Israel, we had people manifested on the tarmac at Munich ready to go, but thank goodness it didn't last long. We did a lot of field maneuvers. We went to the field 3 days a week, had full field layouts on Saturday, had command reveilles and command retreats, and we went to a lot of major training areas for stretches of 30 days at a time. The year before I got there, I wish I'd have got there earlier, because my unit trained in Bad Oost, Germany, and learned how to ski, and they went to Norway and spent a month on skis. But unfortunately, during my time there, we were airlifted to Greece and Turkey, and we played war games, and went from Thessalonica, Greece, all the way into Istanbul. While we were in Greece, the Greek soldiers played aggressors. They were the and then when we got to Turkey, they played the aggressors. The funny thing, both Greece and Turkey were NATO countries, and still are. When our unit got to the border, we had to get off the Greek trucks and walk about 100 yards to go across the border to get onto Turkish trucks. They wouldn't allow each other to cross the border. I made E4 with 11 and a half months in the service. And I'd taken a typing course and learned how to type. It was a 3-week course, and I could type about 20 words a minute after that, which ended up being useful later on in life with the advent of computers. But they were looking for somebody to assist a company clerk, so I worked out of my MOS for a short period of time. And we were at one of the major training areas, and our company commander called the platoon sergeant in, wanted to know if they had anybody to go to NCO Academy that was coming up. And they didn't have anyone, so one of the few times I volunteered, I said, "I'll go, sir," and away I went. It was a 6-week academy, and I always thought I was doing terrible, but I ended up graduating 7th in the class of about, I would say, 120. And one of the cadres told me, he says, "I thought you were going to make it, because if I'd have come in 6th, I'd have been automatically promoted to Sergeant E5. I went back to my unit and went back into a platoon rather than working as a clerk. And within a month or so, I was put in for Sergeant E5. I went in front of a board with probably 15 to 20 other guys, and I was one of 2 in the battalion that was promoted to sergeant. And that was with 17 and a half months in the service, which is pretty remarkable in itself. I spent, that happened like in July. By late December, I'd gotten orders for Vietnam. Our unit was going to go through a reforger thing where 2 of the brigades in Germany were going to come back to Fort Riley, Kansas, and then they would periodically rotate into Germany for war games, and then 2 of the brigades would come back. So they were cutting back on our company. We had in fact closed 1 floor of the 3 floors of the barracks. I put in for an extension on the normal 30-day leave, and got a 45-day leave. I came home shortly after Christmas in probably mid-January of 1968. The Tet Offensive in '68 happened while I was home on leave. I don't remember seeing much about it. I don't think I watched a lot of TV. I learned to drink beer quite well when I was in Germany, and spent a lot of time drinking my middle brother under the floor for a while, till I got acclimated to the American beer again. And I left for Vietnam in late February of 1968. I arrived in country on March 3rd, and originally I believe I was supposed to go to the 3rd Infantry Division, but they were forming a new division called the Americal Division. So I was assigned to it, and we went through a 5-day in-country orientation, and they taught you about booby traps and some of the key phrases to learn, how to tell somebody to stop, how to go away, how to come to you. And at that time you were issued a weapon, and you find out what unit you're going to. And it's the first time I saw an M16. We had trained with M14s in Germany. And I found out I was going to E Troop 1st Cavalry within the 11th Light Infantry Brigade of the Americal Division. And I said, "Is that armor?" And they said, "Yeah." Well, it sort of was armor. We had 3 platoons, each with 9 armored personnel carriers, an APC or track, and those were the same vehicles that we used in Germany when I was in the mech infantry outfit. So the Army, in a way, did something that made sense, because I had the experience with the APCs. Our platoons work independently of each other. Our base camp was at Duc Pho, which is in Quang Ngai Province. Quang Ngai Province is the most southern province of the northern I Corps. We spent time out in the field. We'd go out, come back in to when we're working in our main base camp. The brigade base camp probably housed like 3,000 people. It was fairly large. We had an airstrip, all the comforts of home. Our unit had just come out of Hawaii. They had trained there, and they had arrived in Vietnam December of '67, just a couple months before I got there. When we spent about a month in base camp and then running missions out of it. We also put a couple tracks out on a bridge just south of Duc Pho, keep them from blowing it up at night. And we had a couple tracks go into the MACV compound, which was within the town of Duc Pho, to evacuate them in case they got hit. It was sort of a stand down for us during that month. And then we spent a month in the southern part of our area of operation. We'd guard bridges during the day. We'd run missions during the day. Guard bridges during night, then we'd run missions during the day. Sometimes we'd go out for 1 or 2 day missions. And we worked out at a place called Sai Wen. And that was right close to the border of the I Corps and the II Corps in Vietnam. Then we would rotate north, and that was working out of LZs north of Duc Pho into the area west of Quang Ngai City, and that was not a good area to work in because we were running into uniformed NVA troops there. Where elsewise we were running into VC. We had lots of tracks hit mines. In fact, let's see, it's been March, April, my 3rd month in country on May 17th of '68. One of the track commanders in the 1st platoon was going through an in-country combat leadership course. So I went to that platoon just to work with them while he was going through that training. We were working out of LZ Dottie, and we're supposed to marry up with an infantry company to set up a blocking force so they could sweep through the area. And we were running through dried up rice paddies, and so you're going up and down over rice paddy dikes, and we were pretty late on being where we're supposed to be, so we got up on a wide rice paddy dike and used it sort of as a road. I was the 7th track in the column, and I rolled over a Claymore device, which is a plunger type thing to set off a Claymore mine. It was attached to a dud artillery round. I'm not sure what size. I think it might have been a 155. We weighed about 13 tons with our ammo and everything, and it lifted us 2.5 feet off the ground and left a hole big enough to stand in or lay in. I was cut across the forehead, and my driver cut across his lower chin. I didn't even realize I had been cut. The medic came back and worked on my driver. When he got done, he says, "Let me take care of you." I says, "Why?" And I had blood dripping all down the side of my face, so I got a tourniquet. And they hauled us back to LZ Dottie, and then I went back and rejoined my platoon. I got several stitches in my head, and most of our time we would get into minor firefights. They wouldn't last very long. An armored personnel carrier has a .50 caliber machine gun on it, and that's what I manned. And then behind me I had 2 M60 machine guns. We carried 5,000 rounds of .50 and 5,000 rounds for each of the M60 guns. And you multiply that by 9, and when somebody shot at us and all that opened up, it didn't last very long. The worst thing I got into was in early September of 1968. we were working west of Quangnut City, and we were working with another platoon of armor from the 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry. And we set up a long blocking force. We had 9 tracks. They had 7 and 2 tanks. And we were parked within, I'd say 40 or 50 yards of each other. So it's quite a long line set up as a blocking force. And the South Vietnamese were airlifted in, and they were going to sweep through the valley, and we were to catch anything coming out of it. One of the infantry platoons that was out ahead of us, one of the guys had leaned over a spider hole and got shot and killed. And my track, along with our platoon leader and 2 other tracks, we broke loose and went to their aid. And we set up alongside a village and were shooting into it, and we maneuvered around and set up on the other side of it. And we were actually had rounds that were going into the rest of our unit. They had, in the meantime, while we were engaged in that, they got engaged with a heavy weapons unit of North Vietnamese. So we pulled off of there and rejoined them. And when I got there, we moved up a hill and spread out, but I had an Illinois emblem on my camouflage cover on my helmet, and as I was going up the hill, some guy yelled at Illinois, where are you from? And I said Springfield, and he said me too. It ended up being a guy that graduated from Griffin. I graduated from Fichens High School. We didn't know each other, but at the end of all this, we talked, and we knew a lot of people in common. Anyway, I moved to the far side of the hill, and we set up in a circular area. During all of this, both tanks fired every round they had. I think they carried 50 rounds each. I went through half my ammo, so I went through 2,500 rounds of 50 and 5,000 rounds of M60. We had a helicopter come in during the middle of the night and raked my platoon leader's track because there was a AK had opened up on the helicopter, and my platoon leader opened up one of his guns, and they thought that was the enemy. Luckily, nobody got hurt. They came back in and dropped stuff off. We hadn't had anything to eat all day, so I'd walked back to pick up some cartons of milk and some soda because it's just something to drink. And while I was there, the track next to me got hit with an RPG. And I was sort of blinded from all of it, and I stumbled back into my track, and surprisingly, nobody fired upon during all this. I got back on my vehicle, and I'm standing up, and I'm looking right down the barrel of my 50, and there's another firing of the rocket, and I was aiming right at the dead space between the flashes coming out of both ends of it, and I pressed down on the butterfly and emptied 100 rounds into that area. You're only supposed to fire 5 to 10 round bursts, but 100 rounds at one time won't hurt anything. They didn't fire us anymore. We pulled off that area the next morning. The infantry unit was with us, stayed there, and all that next day, so 2 days after they swept the area, they still found 27 enemy bodies on the ground. They were carrying people off during this. You could see them at a distance, and they estimated we killed close to 100. Luckily, we didn't have anybody hurt seriously, other than the infantry did lose the one guy. Had an infantry guy out in front of my track when that guy fired that second rocket. He got hit with an AK at the same time. With the advent of the internet, we're reconnecting, and somebody was looking for 20. We've got a web page on my unit, and 20 would have been my platoon leader. I was 24 at the time, and I contacted him and I said, I'm not 20, but I'm 24, and he was a platoon leader with the company, the infantry platoon that was at the village that we went in to save. And we traded emails back and forth. This has been about 10 years ago, and our stories matched up pretty decently. I came back from Vietnam, and I went to Fort Hood, Texas, and served in the 1st of the 13th Armor. It was it was a waste of time because everybody in my platoon there, I was a recon platoon there. We had smaller versions of APCs. We had 114s were in Vietnam. We had 113s. All of us were Vietnam returnees, just biding our time until we got out, except for our platoon leader and one Spec 4 who had served in Korea. Spent lots of time in the motor pool, and you can only check the oil levels so often, and it ended up probably being a good time in a way, because we sat inside the tracks and told war stories, and you realize that you weren't the only one that had been through what you'd been through, and so I think it was therapeutic in that way. I was put in for Staff Sergeant E6 and went in front of a promotion board, and I was promoted to E6 about 3 months before I got out. I'm surprised they promoted me, because during the promotion board, the Sergeant Major asked me 3 or 4 times if I was going to stay in the service. I said, no, I'm going to get out. I'm going to go to college. And I did. I started going to Lincoln Land in January of 1970, and I met this young lady named Shirley Calhoun, and we got married Thanksgiving of that year, and are still married. It's 45 years now. She was working for the phone company, and I got an associate's degree in science from Lincoln Land. So I did pass chemistry, and I passed college algebra and trigonometry and analytical geometry and calculus and a bunch of other stuff. I wanted to be an engineer. I had sat in a bar at Waco, Texas, and some guy was talking to me about how he was an engineer and what he did. And I said, well, that sounds pretty cool. I didn't really know what an engineer did until after I got out of school, I believe. But Shirley, working for the phone company, she put in for transfers either to Edwardsville, where I could go to SIU, or to Champaign. And the transfer to Champaign came through, and I had an application in both schools. And I hadn't been accepted yet, and I called up and talked to the associate dean of the College of Engineering. He said, send me your stuff. And he called me back and said, no problem, I'll take you. And away we went. And I graduated from there. I even made the dean's list one semester with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. Backing up a little bit, all the way through Lincoln Land and the University of Illinois, I wore my Army field jacket. And this is 1970 through into 1974. I never had anybody say anything about it. I mean, there was war protesting going on and all that, but I was never affected by it. And I've heard stories about guys when they came back from Vietnam getting spit on and all that stuff. None of that ever happened to me. In fact, I don't know of anybody personally that it happened to. There might be some of those people that are embellishing on their service, but I'm sure it happened to some people. When I got out of the service, my dad wasn't in good health. I had job offers from Bechtel in California, a large consulting firm, Universal Oil Products out of Des Plaines, Illinois, Tennessee Valley Authority. And I had interviewed with the Department of Transportation. And because of my dad's health, I decided to come back to Springfield. And that was a good decision. I worked for the state for about 12 years. And moved from transportation to the Department of Conservation to Illinois EPA. And with Illinois EPA, I got into the environmental field, and that ended up being a real good thing for my career, because I spent the rest of it in doing environmental compliance. Mm-hmm. I wasn't a tree hugger. Environmental engineers either regulate people or try to get people out of trouble with the regulators. I got a job offer with Hansen Engineers, and I spent about 5 years with them. Before I went to EPA, I did did get licensed as a professional engineer, which is a fairly hard test. It's an 8-hour exam, and I believe the fail rate at that time was about 60%. And when I was working with conservation, when I had taken the test, and my chief engineer there had somebody on the board, and you don't normally find out your score, but he called me up to let me know when they set the curve on it and that I had passed it. My adjusted score was a 93. I overstudied, I think. I left Hanson's and I went to work with Andrews Engineers for about a year. I had talked to a guy that I'd worked with at Illinois EPA about going into business, and he said, well, I'm here now, why don't you come with me and then we can see where we go from there. After about a year, we made an offer to buy the division. The two of us were managing, and the owner didn't accept it, and we walked out the door. My wife said, I hope you know what you're doing. We were in business for 10 years and did fairly well. And like all good things, they do come to an end, and got to where the marriage wasn't working well with my partner, and I left there, and I came out of the split fairly well. And shortly thereafter, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And it's hard to believe, but the prostate cancer ended up being a blessing. They did a CT scan and found out I also had kidney cancer. I was 55 years old at the time. And I remember going into the urologist and with my wife, and him telling us he had good news and bad news. He said the good news was the prostate cancer would not be that bad, but you have kidney cancer and we need to deal with it now. I went through back-to-back surgeries a month apart at Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis. The kidney cancer was found early, and they took a silver dollar tumor off my right kidney laparoscopically. So there wasn't a large cut that they normally do. They poked a few holes and operated through them. The following month, I went through a radical prostatectomy. They removed my prostate cancer, and there was still cancer cells on both ends of the dissected gland. So I went through 6 weeks of radiation therapy, and I'd been put on these hormone suppression shots when I was first diagnosed, and I stayed on them for 2 years. When I was first diagnosed, I happened to be on an email group with some people from my division, and one of them said, you need to file a claim with the VA. And I said, why is that? Because my wife, I'm under her insurance, and it's fairly good, and I'm not sure I want a VA doctor working on me. They said, no, you'll get some kind of disability while you're going through treatment. And I was rated at 100% and did go under disability. I put in for a job with the Illinois Department of Public Health, and they'd called me up like in May, and that was in 2004, and wanted to know if I was interested in interviewing for it. I said sure. And I didn't hear anything more from them, and in September they called me back up and asked me to come in for an interview, and it was to head their environmental engineering section. So I knew the answers to all the questions and was hired there, and I spent 4 years there. I was having some headaches and went in for an MRI through the VA, and it came back that I had a metastasized brain tumor. And my wife and I played the end game for about a week, and I went through SIU School of Medicine, and they looked at the scans, and it wasn't a metastasized tumor. It was a benign tumor called a meningioma, which is in the coating your brain. It's in the foramen magna area of my brain, which is the hole that your spine goes through, and it's about the size of a thumbnail. And we did repeated MRIs on it, and it's not doing anything. It's still there to this day, and as long as it's not bothering me, we're not going to bother it, because I like to walk and talk.
Mm-hmm.
Life's been pretty good. We have a 4-bedroom ranch house with 7 acres, and my wife had a horse when we first got married, and she now has 3. So that's her hobby, and I have a steel horse. I have a Harley Davidson, so I spend a lot of time riding that. I was an avid chess player when I was younger, and I continue to play chess this day. I play it online with people all over the world. With the internet, we've reconnected. There's a guy in my unit that lives in Iowa, and he was trying to find the few guys that were on his track. And it grew and grew, and he's found over 180 of us that served with E Troop 1st Cavalry from the time that they arrived in country until the time they departed, and that would have been like from December 67 to somewhere in 1971. There's an all-veterans reunion in Kokomo, Indiana each year that has about 30,000 people come into town, and anywhere from 15 to 25 guys from my unit show up every year. And we also have a Facebook page, and I've ended up being an administrator on it. And our division also has a Facebook page. There's about 1,500 people on the Division one, but there's somewhere around 400 on the brigade side. And on it, probably 50 of them that served in my unit. We've talked about, we talk about a lot of things, current events to our Vietnam experience. And I guess it's therapeutical. I do go through group sessions with the vet center. I have a rating of 50% for post-traumatic stress, as well as 100% for prostate cancer, 20% for my back, which was hurt when I hit the mine, and 10% for tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears.
And do you feel like all of those issues physically, obviously you see doctors and that, how are you handling those now? Like the ringing in the ears and...
I think the post-traumatic stress is probably more of depression from the illnesses that I was diagnosed with. But it's a little bit of both. With us all getting at a retirement age, we went through, and that's one of the things I hate about the media. They paint the Vietnam veteran in such a bad light as being drunks and alcoholics and crazies and stuff. But that's not true at all. Like me, a lot of us spent time raising kids and going to school, raising kids, marriage and everything. We have more time on our hands, and I think gives us more time to think about what we've been through. It's sort of like when we were in one deal in Vietnam. I remember during a lull in it, I sat cross-legged up inside the cupola on the 50, and during a lull I stood down, and my 2 gunners sat down, and they could see me from about lower chest on down, and I started shaking, and one of them says, "What's wrong, Sarge? You scared?" Or cold. I said, "No, I'm scared." And they didn't say anything back. It's, during that lull, you had time to think about what you'd just been through, and now we're at a lull in our life, and we have time to think about what we've been through. We've raised 2 boys, and both of them followed in my footsteps without me pushing them in that direction. They both are engineers. One works for the water district in Vail, Colorado, and the other one works for Illinois EPA here in town. We've been blessed with 2 grandchildren from both of them. The one here, a 6-year-old grandson and a 3-year-old granddaughter. And the one out in Colorado has a 6-year-old grandson that's only 6 weeks apart from his cousin, and another boy that's coming upon 2 years old. My wife's become a very good grandmother.
I'm sure that is a really, being a grandparent, I've heard, is a really cool time, so
yeah.
Looking forward to that someday. Are there any comments or what would you say to somebody, let me put it this way, what would you say to somebody that maybe might see your video or listen to your interview the younger generation, because it will be posted, and someday they might hear it and hear your story. What would you like to say to them?
Our country's a great country, and we can't lose sight of what the roots of our country was. And even if you don't believe in religion, you ought to look at what the tenets of religion are. And you don't steal, you don't cheat, you don't kill. We need to do that if this country's going to survive.
Well, are there any last comments you would like to share?
I got one story to tell, if you'll indulge with me.
Oh, absolutely.
When I was going to college, I worked part-time in a grocery store, when I was in high school, so they rehired me, and it was pretty good pay for while I'm going through college. I was still in Springfield then, and I was getting ready to punch back in the clock after being on break, and I'm looking down at a magazine. I picked up a Mad magazine, and this was in, the election of '72 was coming up, so it was like in the spring of '72, and Mad had a special issue, and it showed pictures of all the presidential candidates, and then on the other side it would have some kind of dumb poster type thing, and one was somebody shooting up and saying, "For those who died in vain." And another one had a bunch of GIs standing over a bunch of dead Vietnamese, uniform, it looked like. And across it was a banner that says "War" is a 4-letter word. And I took a second look at it, and I knew all those guys. And I looked in the background, and I could see the armored personnel carriers. I've shared that picture with a couple of the guys that are in the picture, and surprisingly, neither one of them remember it being taken. We have no clue who submitted it to MAD, but here I'm out of the Army for 2 years, and I'm out of Vietnam for almost 3, and it pops back up in your face. It's sort of like what comes back at you now as you've gotten older and retired.
Sure. And how did that make you feel when you saw that?
You're kidding me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty funny, really, in a way. My division was the Americal Division, and I do want to talk a little bit about it. It was the largest division formed in the history of the United States Army. It's the only named division. Its roots go back to World War II, and in World War II it was formed out of 3 National Guard brigades. One of those brigades came from Illinois. And a couple years ago I was going through the military museum at Camp Lincoln, and I saw a pamphlet that said Illinois National Guard in Vietnam, and it had an AmeriCal patch on it. I picked it up, and a unit out of Quincy, Illinois had got activated during Vietnam, and it's one of probably half a dozen companies that were activated. They served in my division. In fact, some of them served in my brigade. When we came back to our base camp to top off our vehicles with diesel fuel, they may have been doing that, and I didn't know that until just recently. The guy that I saw when I was coming up the hill that yelled, "Hey you, where are you from?" We run into each other occasionally, and I remember early on we talked a little bit about that couple of days. And he says, "Bob," he said, "that's the day I thought I was going to die." Yeah, me too.
And did you have a lot of days like that, where you thought you were going to?
Fortunately not. Oh. Fortunately not.
Well, I want to thank you very, very, very much for sharing your story, and for all those who have shared. I really, personally, I appreciate it, and it's I've learned quite a lot, and I'm very thankful for that. So I do want to thank you.
Well, thank you.
I do want to thank you also for your service to our country.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.